Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's another mini-series within our wider series on the history of revolutionary ideas. In the company of historian Chris Clark, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the revolutions of 1848 that spread across Europe from Sicily to France to Germany to Austria to Hungary and beyond, and reverberated around the world. We're going to be trying to make sense of the ideas lying behind these revolutions, including ideas of previous revolutions. We're going to be looking at the liberal revolution of 1848, the radical revolutions of 1848, and the counter-revolution. But we're going to start with the liberals. Did the liberal revolutionaries understand what it was they had unleashed? Is it possible to characterise, before the revolutions broke out in 1840, what the authorities in Europe thought a revolution was in the 1840s? Where did they think a revolution might be coming from? Who did they think might foment it? Because they were, as people in their position always are, paranoid about revolution. But where were they looking?
Well, everybody had in mind the French Revolution, the original European Revolution, and they remembered the French Revolution as a narrative. It's a complexly structured narrative. What everybody who thought about these things, that means the sort of educated, politically switched on elites of the European cities, what they thought about this revolution was that it unfolded in several different stages, that it began promisingly as a protest against the old regime monarchy of France, that it morphed into a movement for constitutional monarchy, a liberal one, that it then swiftly radicalized and entered a phase of state terror, and that after this there was a period of instability called the Directory, where left and right contended with each other in a sort of uneasy truce. And then, of course, Bonaparte came in to stabilize the country. So when people remembered that original, they were remembering something very complex and many-sided. There wasn't just one thing to remember. There were lots of different bits that you had to put together in your head, and different kinds of people in Europe of the 1840s remembered the different bits of the French Revolution in different ways. There were some who thought very warmly of the liberal revolution of 1789, 1991, but found the state terror of the Jacobin moment in the revolution, 93, 94, horrific and terrifying. And there were others who thought that the on the hard left, I suppose we could call them, who thought that the liberal revolution was a sort of halfway house, and that it was the Jacobins who truly found a sort of discourse and politics of national self-liberation. And they looked on the Jacobins with favor. They were in the minority in the 1840s, but, people look back to that revolution. But, of course, there had been revolutions since the French Revolution of 1789. That also mustn't be forgotten. In the 1820s, there had been a wave of revolutions across the south of Europe, which had drawn a lot of attention throughout the European states, and you can see this in press reporting and so on. There was a revolution in Spain in 1820, and then a sort of sympathy revolt in Naples and Piedmont in Italy and in Portugal, and they all adopted this Spanish constitution, the constitution that had been drawn up in 1812 in the city of Cadiz. So you have those revolutions are remembered as well as a sort of beautiful experiment that failed as a result of international interventions. And then there's the revolution of 1830, which is also remembered. It's also a complex event. It starts in Paris with the Three Glorious Days, but quickly spreads first to Brussels, where in the Kingdom of the United Netherlands it produces a movement to separate Belgium off from the kingdom, and that produces the new Belgian nation state. Belgium then acquires its own constitution, and these 1830 revolts spread across the German lands into central Italy and into Switzerland. In Switzerland too, many of the cantons of Switzerland get new constitutions and new political orders. So, the continent has been shaken by a series of revolutionary episodes, each of which has proved more connective and more capable of cascading from one place to another than the last. So that is what people have in mind when they think of revolution and revolutionaries.
Did the monarchical regimes, when they look back at this complicated history, think that these events broke out spontaneously on the whole, or were they looking for, you use the word revolutionary, as a kind of political actor, a category of political actor? Were they looking for? Were they worried about a certain kind of political actor who might trigger this? Something closer to maybe later in the century, certainly into the 20th century, the idea of the revolutionary as a member of a cell, someone closer to what we might now think of as a terrorist, someone who's trying to light the spark. Was that what they were worried about?
That's a really interesting question. I think that if people are thinking about the French Revolution, they didn't, in general, think in terms of dedicated professional 24/7 revolutionaries of the modern type that we're familiar with. They tended to blame cultural phenomena like the Enlightenment, the decline of religious belief, also the mischief caused by the French monarchy itself. Many at the time thought the French monarchy had it coming in 1789. There was a lot of sympathy across Europe, including from relatively conservative figures for the revolution. That was because the French monarchy was seen as a very flawed polity. So there was that. It was about the failures of the political machine, the economic and fiscal disasters of the French monarchy, and the Enlightenment as a sort of move away from traditional church authority and religious belief, and a preference for the rational questioning of traditional states of affairs. So all of that was seen as crucial. The idea of the revolutionary as someone dedicated possibly to a sort of anonymous or clandestine work as part of an underground cell, that gets going in the 1820s when, secret societies like the Carbonari and also radical offshoots of Freemasonry are deeply involved in the revolutionary movements of the 1820s. And from that point onwards, the police organs become more and more interested in underground organizations, clandestine networks, and so on, as the likely source of the next upheaval. But when they looked back at 1789, most people, I think, understood that the Jacobins, the sort of really radical remakers of the revolution in 1793-94, that they hadn't brought the revolution about. They're a product of the revolution. People saw that the revolutionaries that they feared most were generated by the revolution. But as so often happens with these lessons, that lesson was forgotten. It was replaced by another lesson based on the 1820s experience, that revolution would come from covens of dedicated conspirators operating in clandestine networks.
So when it actually does come at the beginning of 1848, first of all in Sicily, but then in France, in Paris, given that history, what did people see? So maybe we need to describe what happened, but as it started, did they think they were seeing a rerun of 1789? Did they think this was another liberal revolution that maybe this time could be arrested before it reached the Jacobin terror phase? Or did they think, these secret cells have been doing their work?
Well, this is interesting. I think initially they didn't know what was happening. I mean, they were just completely flabbergasted. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But your question is interesting about whether they thought, is this going to be a repeat, a rerun? Because I think liberals had been struggling. Liberals were aware of this danger, and liberals had been pressing very hard the argument in many different parts of Europe in different language, but it's the same argument that, it's not going to happen again because we've learned that you must arrest the revolution. You must arrest an upheaval in its liberal tolerant phase. You cannot allow a further radicalization. So they thought, we've seen the danger and we can forearm our politics against that danger of history simply repeating itself. So that was the liberal answer to that claim that once the liberals take power, we'll see the Jacobins next. They said it needn't work out like that. In the 1820s, indeed, there was not really a sort of Jacobin supersession in that way of the original liberal revolution. So that was the argument they made. The circumstances by which revolution broke out were puzzling to contemporaries because it seemed to them hard to see the reason why a revolution broke out at a particular moment. They were aware of the social question, of the social and economic distress afflicting European populations, but they also knew that these were chronic forms of distress. It was like gout, not like a heart attack. So they knew that. But when confronted with the fact that the streets were full of people and that the authorities had lost control over great cities like Palermo, in the capital city of the Sicilian part of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or Paris, they were confused because in the case of Palermo, the cause, in as much as there was a cause of the uprising in Palermo, was actually a poster which had appeared on the walls of the city at the beginning of January, announcing that in a few days, on the 12th of January, there's going to be an uprising, there's going to be a revolution. The moment of liberty is near. Sicilians, prepare for your liberation. And it was signed at the bottom, Comitato Revoluzionario, Revolutionary Committee. But the fact was that there was no Revolutionary Committee. This is a sort of prank. And it had been written and printed by someone called Francesco Bagnasco as a kind of joke. He thought maybe it would be enough to get things going. And bizarrely, Bagnasco was right. The people came out onto the street to see, hey, where's this revolution? This is going to be fun. Let's make sure we're there to see it. And they discovered they were the revolution. They were like the animals in the Aesop's fable who are invited to dinner and find that they are themselves the dinner. Because, of course, the military authorities had seen this poster, and they also tripled the troop strengths in the streets. And the presence of lots of troops armed to the teeth and lots of citizens was enough to get something going. So Lamartine put it very well when he commented that in many places the revolutions seemed to be generated by curiosity, the curiosity of crowds about what was going to happen next. In other words, that there was an element of spontaneous combustion about the actual moment of inception. And that's, I think, one of the things that confuses people, because it means that the police authorities had been looking all that time for exactly the wrong kind of revolution. They were quite good at this. They were good at infiltrating underground organizations and with spies and so on, and honey traps and you name it, and reading people's letters. And they were quite good at breaking networks and sticking people in jail or hanging them. But one thing they weren't prepared for and never had, either psychologically or technically or strategically, was a sort of pan-societal upheaval, where society was going to be, great numbers of people were going to become a collective actor in a moment of disinhibition.
One of the ironies here, I think, is that Sicilian story, it's like a parody of what they thought they were looking for. The Revolutionary Committee announces a revolution. There's no Revolutionary Committee, but there is a revolution. Whereas what happens in Paris just a few weeks later is a version of the liberal fantasy of a revolution, in the sense that, my understanding of it, the trigger, if there is a political trigger, is increasing ferment over the question of the franchise, a classic political constitutional question, and debating societies and banqueting societies and clubs, associations, those 19th century institutions, start to mobilize in frustration, in anger against what feels like a classic political question of the right of people to vote. It's not posters on the street announcing a revolution. This one looks more like the early stages of 1789, doesn't it? Until very quickly it doesn't.
I mean, the interesting thing about, you mentioned already banquets, the interesting thing here is the background choreography to the events of February 1848. It really can only happen in the way it does in Paris because there's been this movement of banquets organized by liberal worthies right across France, and it's an extremely impressive movement. I mean, banquets are nothing new. They've been going on throughout the first half of the 19th century. They're a crucial tool of political communication and mobilization, and they usually had been organized as part of the effort to prepare for elections. And what happens in 1848, in February 1848, is that a massive banquet has been planned for the 12th arrondissement, which is a relatively restless working class district of Paris. And it's going to be coordinated by the National Guard, the Garde Nationale, which is supposed to be taking care of it, also looking after security and so on. And then at the last moment, the government decides to ban this banquet. But the news of the ban is imperfectly communicated, so large numbers of people turn up on the day of the banquet anyway to cheer the deputies and so on who are on their way to take part. So you need that background of banqueting for the revolution to break out in the way it does. But the question is about the franchise, because increasingly the banquets had been focusing on the issue of whether one shouldn't broaden the franchise. And the franchise was a tiny nano franchise. It was less than 1% of the French population. And it was really only the wealthiest men who had any chance of taking part in this system. So it was really like the nano nation, a tiny, shrunken miniature of the nation represented in the French Chamber of Deputies. And the problem there was that there were different franchises in France. So you could be enfranchised for one jurisdiction for municipal elections, for example, but not be enfranchised for national elections. And in Paris, that was a particular problem, where you had people who crisscrossed in overlapping franchises who were enfranchised in one category but not in the other. And to them, this seemed completely unnatural. And the actual members of the National Guard in the 12th arrondissement, they were an example. Many of them were enfranchised in one form of election but not in the other. So it was a system that seemed increasingly incoherent and internally inconsistent. And why should you be allowed to vote for example, representatives of the municipal assembly, but not be allowed to vote for the Chamber of Deputies? And so the issue became really, really hot. All of a sudden, it became a kind of cause célèbre and something people were prepared to go into the streets for. It's an interesting example of the different temporalities of politics. These revolutionary situations always operate on multiple speeds. There's the gradual accumulation of ideological critique of the existing system. There's the kind of chronic ailments of a not very well-functioning economy and very stagnant demand and so on. Those are processes that operate in years. And then there's the momentary ignition of the kind we talked about in Palermo, or people being fired on in the crowd, which is one of the things that triggered the revolution in Paris. But in between that is the medium speed, which is the events that unfold in weeks, in 6, 7 days, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. That kind of medium durée, as it were, where you're talking about issues that suddenly become neuralgic questions.
And the franchise became a neuralgic question, but it had two faces in the sense that it was a classic liberal question. So the liberals who wanted to broaden the franchise didn't want to broaden it to everybody by any means. This wasn't like a mass enfranchisement. It wasn't what we might now call democratic. But the trigger for the revolution is a popular uprising in the name of this cause, this issue, which is a democratic moment. I mean, this is people in the streets, many of whom, presumably, the liberals would not have wanted to enfranchise. Many of those who ended up in the streets were not part of this movement for wider participation and representation. So the liberal revolution and the more radical democratic revolution, they come together, do they?
Well, they do. I mean, this is where the franchise is such a sort of hot button issue, because it's the point where the political revolution and the social revolution converge. They become entwined, because the question of who you let into the representative assembly is a question of both of social and of political import. And so you can no longer separate the constituencies. That's why it's an area where along a sort of fault line along which conflicts can break out. And in the case of the liberals in France, I mean, with the exception of the so-called doctrinaire liberals, who are effectively very conservative liberals of the kind, around Guizot, a very intelligent and in some ways quite far-sighted and thoughtful statesman who wrote dozens and dozens of books, some of them very good, but one of the great thoughtful political figures of his time, but presiding over a system with a tiny, tiny franchise. And then you had a large number of liberals who were critical of Guizot and the liberal opposition. They wanted a somewhat larger franchise. They were rather hazy about exactly how large it should be. And then, of course, you had people on the radical spectrum, but some of those radicals really were liberals, like Lamartine and so on, who wanted universal suffrage for men, of course. But even universal suffrage often didn't really mean all men. There are often lots and lots of loopholes once you got down into the sort of proletariat, which would keep people of the lowest status out of the voting process. So people were still interested, even radicals were quite interested in voter suppression, except people on the far left.
One of the other things that became a necessary condition for this revolution to spread was that the regime collapsed very quickly in France. I mean, in the face of this, in a matter of days and weeks, the house of cards fell in. Why?
Yeah, this was one of the great surprises for revolutionaries in that moment was, they've forgotten now who put it this way. I think it was Bassermann, one of the German liberals, said, we pushed at this door and it turned out the door was not locked. In fact, it wasn't even closed. It just flew open. We walked through. That was a big, big surprise. And I think that has to do with the accumulated uncertainty of these previous revolutions we were talking about before, the French Revolution, the 1820s, 1830. I mean, it's like a drumbeat, isn't it, of upheaval. And each time leaving aside the original French Revolution, each time the upheavals get more serious, more difficult to master, and also more infectious. The phenomenon of political contagion becomes more impressive. Who was it who said the first thing that a declining civilization loses is its self-confidence? I think the same applies to the Ancien Regime monarchies of Europe at this time, that they had lost faith in themselves. They were on the defensive. and they were casting around. There was a big debate in Prussia as to whether there shouldn't be a constitution, for example, right through the 1840s. Lots of arguments about this right at the top of the government. The king said, I'd rather be torn into 1,000 pieces than concede a constitution, but people around him were pressing him in this direction. So these systems are already uncertain of themselves. They're not sure anymore that history is on their side. And so that lack of self-confidence, I think, explains why things collapse so quickly.
And it therefore became a revolution as it spread from France, from Sicily, France, and then it spread to Germany, to Central Europe and beyond. And we'll talk about that. But it became a revolution of legislatures, of parliaments, of enfranchisement, of constitution making. These are classic liberal ideas. I think it's fair to say this is part of the imagination, even the fantasy of the liberal revolution. The people rise up, and the result is a movement for constitutional reform. The result is the empowerment of parliaments and legislatures. But at the same time, the people have risen up. And one of the questions of revolutionary politics is, can you accommodate a popular uprising if the politics ends up revolving around parliamentary and constitutional arguments about political form?
This was one of the really difficult problems of 1848, was that, of course, they did quickly produce parliaments. And actually, these parliaments are incredibly impressive achievement. I mean, it's an enormous amount of labor is required to make a parliament, to convene a parliament, organize its procedures, and so on. And their emergence is something I think we should be very impressed by. At the same time, though, these parliaments they were staid, they were slow, they were a bit boring. I mean, a lot of contemporaries who became deputies, in these first euphoric elections, when they walked as people's representatives into these chambers, there was a sense of rebirth and really tremendous excitement. But once the business of parliament got going, it's quite funny how a lot of these people who are sitting in these parliaments complain that they're actually rather boring. They said we spent 3 weeks working out the order of precedence for speeches and how long people are allowed to speak, and debating issues like whether students should be allowed to come and present petitions, or this kind of thing. But that's what democracy is. Democracy has a dull and procedural side if it's that representative parliamentary form of democracy.
Exactly. Liberal democracy does.
Liberal democracy does, yeah. But in the meanwhile, the ferment continued out on the streets. And what people on the streets felt, people who politically radicalized people on the street and activists, they thought, hang on, what happened to the sovereignty of the people? The people is still sovereign. The people has not ceded its sovereignty to this representative body who, as far as we can tell, look like very well-off taxpayers and don't really represent the people in its sort of richness and fullness. Because, and this is another one of the great themes of the revolution, the process of expanding the suffrage turned out not to produce a radicalization of the content of politics. It actually produced a weird sort of consolidation of conservative and liberal hegemony. And that was a body blow. It was really a punch to the gut of the left, who struggled with this question of why, when they were asked to name their representatives, so many people out there, especially out there in the countryside, people one didn't necessarily know or know very much about, they chose moderate liberal individuals like Tocqueville, for example, who won hands down in Wallonia, his Norman constituency, said, I've never been so popular in my life as I was on the day of the elections. This is marvelous. I mean, it was great for him. But the same thing happened all over France. People chose the local people they knew, the notables, the people who had a reputation, who could speak well, who were nicely dressed, and so on. And there are lots of comments like this in the German Revolution as well, and in the Austrian Revolution. People say, people tend not to abandon the old authorities. They chose the people that they understood and accepted as wielding a certain authority because they spoke well, because they dressed well. So that was a big disappointment to the left. And on the streets, we find a lot of people who are unwilling to relinquish the notion of popular sovereignty, but no longer see it as answered by the emergence of a liberal parliament.
Is this where the shadow of the First French Revolution, the 1789 revolution, hung heavily? Because one way of reading that is that what had begun as a liberal, legislative-based, constitution-making revolution became an executive revolution. Power was ceded by the representative body into the smaller and smaller hands. The Committee of Public Safety shrinks and shrinks, and it controls the revolution by the exercise of executive power. So the liberal might think in 1848, we mustn't let that happen again. We've got to arrest the revolution in its liberal form, which means we mustn't go down the road of thinking the central question is who wields executive power. And yet, if you don't address that question, someone's going to wield executive power, and you will be squeezed in a way between the people on the streets. That's a form of, if not executive power, at least it's a form of direct power, and the established authorities, including the military authorities, who will retain the ability to control the direction of travel of events. So is it possible that one way to read what happened is that, I think of, say, Engels in a later age, in the 1870s, his line about liberal revolutionaries is their problem was they didn't realize, I quote, or I paraphrase, that a revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is. If it's not authoritarian, it's not going to work. But the liberal revolutionaries of 1848 thought that the lesson of the French Revolution was that the authoritarianism of the executive was the thing that undid it.
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and it's quite a difficult one. I mean, I think that the situation in France, if we think about the 1848 setting, is unusual and perhaps in some ways unique, because in France, the monarchy actually does fall. So there is a revolution which replaces one kind of political regime with another, and that's the Second Republic initially. And then when the Second Republic is replaced by the Empire under Napoleon III, that is still not a replication of the pre-1848 Guizot monarchy. It's something else entirely. So you're never going to get back to where you have been. It's a completely new departure. That's not the case, though, in Austria, in Prussia, and so on. In Prussia and Austria, the monarchy is still there. And the revolution breaks out in Vienna and in Berlin, but it sort of flows around the structures of the old authority and kind of isolates them to some extent and puts them under pressure, but it doesn't do away with them or replace them. And so there, the big question is, if it's liberals dealing with executive authority, how do you make kings understand the path to be plotted out, right? The path to be navigated. And that's one of their biggest tasks is manage what self-help textbooks call managing upwards. How do you manage the boss and make him do what you need him to do? And what liberals mostly did was, well, in the case of the Austrian monarchy, it was more complicated because it was the actual regnant personality was a man, how shall I put this, a man of limited intellectual resources. Very nice and likable sort of chap, but a chap who, when he heard the noises out in the streets, he was famously quoted as having said, when he heard the noise of revolution in the streets of Vienna, he said, well, what's all that noise? And they said, well, they're making a revolution, sire. And he said, are they allowed to do that? And his people replied, no, actually, they're not. They're not allowed to do that. And so on. So anyway, there it was complicated by the fact that you weren't dealing with a powerful monarchical individual, but with a network of Habsburg courtiers and officials and functionaries. But in Berlin, you had the problem that Frederick William IV is still in control. He still controls an army, as does indeed the imperial court in Austria. It has its own army, so does the Prussian monarchy, and so do the monarchies in the other German states. They all have armies which by and large remain loyal to the crowned heads. And so then the question is, how do the liberals deal with that? Well, they deal with it by bringing a number of liberals into the cabinet, by recommending certain courses of action to the king, by trying to persuade the king that actually under a constitutional order he will have more power, not less. The kingdom will be more stable. This is the argument that's made, for example, to the king of Piedmont, Sardinia in Turin. He is told, if you issue a statute, if you issue a constitution, it won't weaken you, it will actually strengthen you, because you will have a parliament which will be answerable to you, and you'll be ruling through the best of your citizens, of your subjects, and we will all be there together, and there is security in numbers, and you'll be at our apex. So this will be better for you, not worse. And, by and large, this line of argument works in the kind of panicky moment of 1848. It seems a very strong argument. So I must say, I think that although in later years people on the left would develop a certain contempt for the liberal relationship with power, I think that in 1848, the liberals were fairly canny about power, and they weren't afraid of executive power. In fact, rather the opposite. They were a bit servile towards it. They tried to hide themselves under its wings, partly because they were so fearful of a further radicalization from the left. So that fear that it wouldn't be possible to let the revolution go thus far but no further remained crucial. And that is the really big problem for liberals. The fact that it's always a question of adjudication. We want to get to a certain point, but then we want to stop. And first there's the question of which point is that? And when do you do the stopping? And then, if you let things get that far, why not let them go further? And radicals never ceased in pointing this out. They said liberalism is a totally inconsistent form of politics because they want to be carried into power by a massive tumult, but then they want the tumult to stop. There's nothing here for you. Go home, peace and calm, business as usual. But why? On what grounds? How do they legitimate their claim that the revolution stops at this point and not at some point further down the road?
Was France also exceptional in the sense that the French Revolution of 1789, one of the things it had done was to create a nation. It foregrounded the idea that the nation was the organizing body of political life. Whereas in Germany, as we now call it, but in Germany with many different polities, in Italy, in the Habsburg Empire, the idea of nationalism, which is part of this revolutionary story, but it's much less coherent. Is it clear in the other parts of Europe which way nationalism points? Does it point to a liberal revolution? Does it point to a counter-revolution? Does it point to something more radical?
Nationalism points in every conceivable direction. But you're absolutely right that in the case of Germany, where the idea of a German nation is radically at odds with the actual political map of Europe, because there is no Germany. There are 39 different German states, some of them really important ones that we know about, whose names are familiar, like Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, Baden, and so on. But on the other hand, lots of others that nobody cares about now, like Anhalt-Köthen, for example, was a state, an independent sovereign state. So how do you get from the situation where you have tumult in dozens of different German cities and towns, and the Bavarian king is under pressure, and so is the king of Saxony, and so is the king of Prussia? How do you get from that situation of a very decentered, fragmented revolutionary phenomenon to a German project? And the answer is by very long and sinuous paths. It certainly can't happen overnight. And one of the routes towards the nation is the formation of a national parliament, which happens in 1848 in Frankfurt, the Nationalversammlung, the national parliament or national assembly of the Germans, which does have deputies. And again, it's a remarkable achievement just to get that thing together. Hundreds of deputies meeting from all over German-speaking Europe to talk about the affairs of a country that doesn't exist, a country called Germany that still does not exist and won't exist for the foreseeable future. So that's one path towards the nation. And another is for someone like the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, to say, well, you know what, I'm going to place myself at the head of the movement, which he actually says in the March days of 1848. Things are just getting going. He rides out through the streets of Berlin dressed in a tricolour, the black, red and gold tricolour of the German national movement, which is now the German national flag. And he says, I'm going to place myself at the head of the movement, by which he means that a German national movement. But of course, he doesn't want the parliamentary nation of the Frankfurt National Assembly. He wants a different kind of nation, a nation which will be negotiated with the other crowned heads of the German states, and which will emerge under Prussian captaincy, under Prussian influence. So these are complex paths, and one has to add to that, and I'm just mentioning this because it's an example of the problems of nationalism everywhere, that the German nation, the German national dream, looks very different if you're a Catholic German from what it looks like if you're a Protestant German. If you're a Protestant German, you're likely to be quite affirmative. You're likely to warm to that Prussian vision of a Prussian-dominated Germany that excludes Austria and all those non-German, Slavic and Magyar lands of the Austrian Empire. On the other hand, if you're a Catholic German, well, the last thing you want to do is exclude Austria, because the greatest dynasty, the greatest Catholic dynasty in Europe is the Habsburg dynasty. And so your map of Germany is a different map. And there are plenty of German Catholics who felt that when Bismarck formed Bismarck and the King of Prussia and everybody else around them formed the first German Empire in 1871, they felt Germany hadn't been unified, it had been divided, because it had shut out so many Catholic Germans as they saw it. So nationalism is this ambient, ever-present source of emotional food for emotional mobilizations, but it points in lots of different directions and it divides people as often as it unites them.
And I know the answer to this is going to be it really depends where you are. But if you are a liberal in 1848 in this revolutionary tumult, what are you thinking about religion and the role of the Catholic Church? I mean, on the one hand, one classic liberal position is to want to limit the authority of religious bodies and to establish the primacy of the political, the primacy of the representative system of politics over those other claims over citizens. On the other hand, this is a popular uprising. This is a mass movement. This is an extremely febrile time. And one of the lessons of the French Revolution is religion really matters.
Absolutely.
So if you're a liberal, are you torn on this?
Liberals are ambivalent. I mean, that ambivalence is their thing.
So they are torn by definition.
So they're a bit torn. They're always torn about everything, and it can get a bit tiresome after a while. There's sort of hand wringing and worrying about on the one hand and on the other hand. But I think that what liberals felt about religion, they were smart about religion. They saw that, as you say, religion mattered, and they saw that the French Revolution had demonstrated that. And what they tended to say, I mean, a very good example, because he articulated it so well, but I think he was simply expressing views that many liberals shared, was that there were good and bad aspects of religion. This is Benjamin Constant, the sort of student and close friend of Madame de Staël, who, in an essay on religion, made the point that by and large, priestly and ecclesiastical forms of religion, church hierarchies, bishops, this kind of thing, had been bad for liberty. The phenomenon of religious sentiment, le sentiment religieux, had been good for liberty. And he thought that, a liberal polity would not work if people were not joined together, were not rendered more organically connected by a shared sentiment of what was good and sacred in life. And he thought that was all to the good. What wasn't to the good was the sort of unaccountable authority of priests and bishops and archbishops, which he called sacerdotal or priestly religion. And so those are the kinds of distinctions that liberals could make. And it was wise to make those distinctions because the great majority of people were still religious in one way or another. And it's a striking feature of the 1820s liberal revolutions that they were very supportive of religion. The Cadiz Revolution of 1812, which then is adopted again in 1820 to 23 in Spain and picked up in Piedmont and in Sicily in the 1820s, opened by saying that the religion of the nation is the Catholic Church, is Catholicism. So they were very affirmative of the authority of the Catholic Church, and they tended not to be particularly tolerant of religious pluralism. They didn't want to allow other voices to be heard. And of course, for some of them, this was a genuine matter of conviction, but for most, I think it was also a pragmatic concession to the power of religion as an anchorage for the great number of people. And so liberals, it was a complex question to deal with. I think it's important, though, to remember that this phenomenon of liberal anti-clericalism, a sort of knee-jerk hatred of priests and religious culture and a constant bickering and fighting against the religious and against even attacks on religious belief, that's not really a phenomenon of this era. That comes later, during the culture wars of the later 19th century, when things get much more polarized. The church becomes, one of its central raison d'etre becomes an attack on liberalism, on modernity in its liberal form. And the liberals respond by developing a form of liberalism that can't survive without anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism becomes a sort of glue for liberals. But before that, I think it's a much more complex picture.
One of the symbols of that is the extraordinary role that the Pope played in the story of 1848. It's one of the things that makes 1848, I think, feel distant, that to start with at least, the Pope could be seen by some people, the new young Pope, as a symbol of change. It didn't last.
Well, he was a symbol of change, and with good reason, because he, when he came to the throne in 1846, he replaced Gregory XVI, who was a really strikingly reactionary figure. This was a man who'd forbidden gas lights to be installed in the city of Rome because he thought if the streets were lit, people would fornicate in them. And he didn't want railways because he thought that would allow ideas to traverse too quickly across the kingdom. So, and then when the new Pope, Pius IX, a man, his name was Mastai Ferretti, but he became Pius IX, was elected, because of course this was an elective monarchy, the papal monarchy, came to the throne of the Papal States in 1846. And one of the first things he did was to issue a general amnesty of political prisoners, people sitting in the jails because they'd been involved in dissenting publications or whatever, immediately freed. And he also said he was interested in bringing in gaslighting. He showed an interest in railways. He created a thing called the Consulta, which was a sort of consultative body which didn't just have clergymen on it. They seemed amazingly radical at the time. Not just priests, but actually some local liberal worthies and newspaper editors and so on. So there was a sign that things were moving in the right direction from the liberal standpoint. And to that, one has to add that this Pope was relatively young. He was certainly compared to the very elderly Gregory, but he was also kind of smiley and charismatic and warm and good at speaking in extempore. And he enjoyed crowds and he enjoyed communicating. He's the first Pope ever to have published an edition of his own speeches. That had never happened before, or to have seen such an edition into print. And he was good looking. I mean, this is another thing. People said he's a handsome, beautiful pope. Has a beatific, saint-like face. He has radiant features and so on. There's a lot of sort of almost erotic appreciation of the pope's appearance. So it's a very special moment in the history of the papacy. And he was, as he walked about Rome, which he often did just with a couple of priests in those relatively innocent days, he was mobbed by crowds. It was a kind of love fest, and it went on for months and months and months, into 1847. And he became a kind of the surface onto which people projected their hopes and dreams. And one of those dreams was the creation of an Italian nation state. So they started saying, Viva Pio IX, that's what they said, long live Pius IX, long live the King of Italy. And it wasn't quite clear, well, who is the King of Italy? And is that supposed to be the same person as Pius IX? And then quite often there'd be massive gatherings of people in front of the Quirinale Palace, and they would demand a benediction. They wanted to be blessed at 8 o'clock in the evening, and he would come out and he would bless them. And then a few hours later another crowd would emerge and they wanted to be blessed as well, and he would be got out of bed and he would come and issue another benediction, and so on and so forth, sometimes into the small hours. And the question then was asked by some perceptive contemporaries, who's in charge here? Is the Pope controlling the crowds, or are the crowds using the Pope? And this festival of love lasted until April 1848, when the Pope came out in the face of what was going on and saw that war with Austria was impending and that a revolution was really unfolding across Europe. He came out and said, "Do not misuse my name. I'm not to be used for this revolution, and I will not be pressed into a war against the Catholic power Austria." And at this point, the lights were switched off and the love fest just collapsed, and a tremendous sense of despair and disappointment replaced it.
Do you think that's emblematic of some of the wishfulness of early 1848? I mean, maybe this is just hindsight, but with hindsight, it does look a little bit optimistic that the Vatican would be at the head of what, even when it was a liberal revolution, was still a revolution.
It was. I mean, one can forgive them for thinking that things would change, because, in fact, they did change under Pius IX, and he did introduce a number of liberal, what was it reviewed at the time as liberal. So there was a certain, I suppose nowadays, if these were conservative changes, we'd call them dog whistling. I mean, he dog whistled to the liberal constituents, if you like.
Which is a dangerous thing to do.
Which is a dangerous thing to do. So people got very excited. And then at some point, I mean, he too had his point, up to which and no further. And that's when the mood changed.
As you said, Gregory, his predecessor, was worried that with the railways, ideas would travel. And he wasn't wrong about that. He may have been wrong about people fornicating under the gaslights. So this is another feature of the liberal revolution. We're going to talk more about how this story unfolds as it both becomes more radical and then also more reactionary. But one feature of ideas of liberalism was that it is about ideas travelling. And in early 1848, the speed at which the news travelled and the influence of newspapers, the influence of some of the classic institutions of the liberal world of letters, these were the conduits of the revolution. Did that give people the impression, as this spread so quickly and as it spread across Europe, and it seemed to recreate itself in the form of constitution making and demands for franchise and for empowered parliaments, did those things seem to people to feed together? Was this maybe one of the other illusions at work here, that what was going on as this spread so quickly was a transfer of ideas? Because that is a liberal hope. Why did the revolution, this early liberal revolution, why did it recreate itself so rapidly in so many places? Was that, as liberals might think, because good ideas were spreading fast?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's a Danish historian called Jorgensen who uses the phrase trans-urban interconnectivity to explain the speed of the spread of revolution, and says that there are sort of invisible networks of communication, the exchange of material in newspapers, for example, correspondence networks, which help to explain why the revolution can shift so quickly. I don't think, although the conservatives of the Ancien regime had thought this was about ideas, bad ideas moving about, I don't think that's really how it worked. It's more like a kind of shared horizon of expectations than about the sort of export-import of ideas as such, as kind of compact units. And you see this best, I think, if you look at the liberal organs, the liberal newspapers of the 1840s, especially the period leading right up to 1848. One striking feature is the emphatically European horizon horizon of events. They're all writing about stuff that's going on in other European states. They see Europe as a joined up social system. And the newspaper La Réforme, for example, in Reform in Paris, is constantly reporting on events in the Italian states, even Wallachia, what we now call Romania, events in the German states, events in Spain, and so on. And the Spanish liberal press reports on events right across Europe. And they make it quite clear that they don't see these upheavals and protests and waves of petitions and representations to parliaments or demands for parliaments. They don't see these as discrete, momentary spasms confined to particular locations. They see them as part of an interconnected malaise of European society. So I think it's more about the horizons of awareness than it is about the traffic in ideas as such.
And the newspapers themselves, the newspaper editors, I mean, these were people at this time who also had maybe illusions or delusions about their power, their influence. Was this, at least to start with, in any meaningful sense, a revolution that had been fomented by newspapers, by journalists, by editors?
Oh, I mean, the importance of newspapers is so enormous that it can scarcely be overstated. I mean, this is an era which some French historians have called this the era of the civilization of the newspaper, the civilisation du journal. And 1848 is a beautiful example of that because the provisional government in Paris is actually drawn up effectively by the staffs, the editorial staffs of the La Nation and La Réforme, a sort of right, liberal, and radical paper, get together, put together a list of possible ministers from the sort of notables of the political opposition, if you like, and then read it out to the crowd in front of the Hôtel de Ville. And then when there's a cheer, they say, okay, tick. If there are boos, they say cross, he comes off. And then at one point, somebody in the crowd says, what about my friend here, Monsieur Albert? He killed a Swiss guard or something like that. He did something brave, outside the Tuileries, whatever. And everybody cheers Monsieur Albert. So then Monsieur Albert, who knows nothing whatsoever about politics, is also made a minister and becomes one of the sort of absurdities of 1848 is Monsieur Albert, a man of left opinions, but not really someone with any experience of ministering anything. So it's very much a process shaped by the newspapers and by newspaper editors. And newspapers are crucial in Berlin too, in the last days before the revolution breaks out on the 18th of March. People who have a newspaper are forced to stand up on a chair and read out the relevant articles because people are so thirsty for news. So it's the glory days, basically, of the journalist's profession. One can only look back, I think, as a journalist with nostalgia at those days when the press mattered in a way that's very difficult to imagine now.
Again, there's a way of reading what you just described. The editors, the journalists of a paper of the, let's call it the centre-left, and a paper of the centre-right coming together in this revolutionary moment where the old regime has abdicated power to help create a new ministry. There's popular acclaim, so the people are involved, but they're not actually involved in the sense this isn't a mass enfranchisement. Reading out names in front of a crowd is not the same as letting everybody vote. There are some absurdities, Monsieur Albert. But it's a little like a liberal fantasy, actually, of a revolution. Journalists coming together from rival camps to put together a government of all the talents and so on.
Oh, it is. It is.
In the French Revolution, in the original French Revolution, there were moments of violence that punctured liberal illusions. The September massacre is probably prime among them before it really descends into terror. In the early months, up to the early summer of 1848, in the liberal phase of the revolution, we could also maybe call it the theatrical phase of the revolution. There was a lot of theatre, some of it great theatre, some of it absurd theatre. There was also already quite a lot of violence, not as much as was to come, but quite a lot of violence. These were not bloodless events by any means. How much is it possible to discern a feeling of impending disaster if the goal here was to arrest the revolution in the form, the liberal goal, in the form in which it could stop short of as the liberals might have seen it, the catastrophes that befell the French Revolution from 1792 onwards. Yet the streets were full, the crowds were restless, people were hungry. Someone was going to have to take charge of this. Soldiers were armed. How much of a feeling was there that in the end, the violence was going to be determinant?
I think there is a continuing and persistent anxiety about violence. People understand liberals, and this is not something new. In the 1830s, too, the 1830 revolutions, liberals had been propelled into power by processes of tumult and violence. And then they had tried, as they would try again in 1848, to sort of stabilize the situation. And so they knew about that danger, they worried about it, and the initial proclamation of the Republic, issued in France during the February Revolution, contains an interesting reference where it says, once again, as in 1830, the precious blood of the people has been shed. And it goes on, but this time it will not be shed in vain. So the idea was, last time we didn't get it right? The Liberals took control, and then you got your tiny nano franchise. No one got the vote, and it was sort of business as usual under a different monarchy. It's not going to happen again. This time the people will get their reward. But then the question, of course, remained, what happens if they don't get their reward, or they don't feel that they have? And in Paris, everybody knew the city was full of radical clubs. There are numerous radical clubs, radical journals that continued to write in the name of the sovereign people. In Berlin, too, there were radical clubs that spoke disrespectingly of the parliament, said the parliament does not represent us. This is just a bunch of tax-paying bigwigs, and nowadays you might call them oligarchs. And so there was this sense. I mean, this is the fundamental difference between radicals and liberals in the revolution of 1848 was, did you think the revolution was an event? If you thought it was an event which had taken place at one moment and that now was complete and whose legacy had to be managed, then you were liberal. If you thought the revolution was a process that was still underway, you were a radical. And that difference between processual and event understandings of the revolution, of course, contained worlds of mischief in it.
And if it was an event, the assumption was presumably that the violence of the event was now essentially over. If it was a process, the assumption was the violence was latent in almost everything that was still to come.
Absolutely. In its darkest articulation, the message of that processual understanding was, you ain't seen nothing yet. So that was the fear of the center, that the left would just simply keep on going. And there you can see the legacy of the French Revolution, its importance, because people thought, oh no, what if this happens again? What if, having launched a sort of constitutional monarchy and with balanced powers and an independent judiciary and the citizen protected from arbitrary arrest and freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of the press, what if then it's drowned in a kind of horrible leftist authoritarian experiment? What do we do then? And of course, a lot of these fears they felt real to the people who had them. But looking back in retrospect, it's clear that they were completely out of proportion to any actual threat. There was no massive violent leftist movement about to impose itself on the polity. There was simply continuing dissatisfaction. And the liberals ought to have had the flexibility and the intelligence in that moment of panic. Of course, it's difficult to be flexible and smart when you're very scared, but they ought to have been flexible and smart enough to see that you could build compromises with the social demands of the revolution and do more to answer those demands, which were, in retrospect, appear very justified demands from people who were suffering most and whose lives had been so vulnerable and so exposed to economic distress in the last couple of decades.
There are a few tickets left if you would like to come and see PPF live at the Curious Minds Festival in Bath on Saturday the 29th of March. I'm going to be talking to historian and regular PPF contributor Robert Saunders about Winston Churchill. This year is the anniversary of Churchill's death. It's the anniversary of VE Day, his greatest triumph. It's the anniversary of Gallipoli, his greatest disaster. Winston Churchill remains the most fascinating, the most controversial, the hardest to pin down politician in all of British political history. And Robert and I are going to try and make sense of him and his legacy. Who really was he? And how should we remember him? If you would like to come and listen to and take part in that conversation, you can get tickets. Just go to our website, ppfideas.com, click on the events page, and you will see how. We would love to see you there. Next time, on the 1848 revolutions, it's the radical revolutions, the subject we touched on at the end of today's episode. Just how radical, just how violent, just how revolutionary did it get? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future. part of the Airwave podcast network.